My husband slept with my sister, got her pregnant, and now my family wants my forgiveness, but I vanished. And what happened next was a reckoning they never saw coming. Before my world burned to the ground, it was beautiful. It was the kind of life you see in curated photo albums, a life of quiet suburban streets, Sunday brunches, and a love I thought was invincible. Mark and I had been married for 7 years, together for a decade. We were high school sweethearts who had navigated college, first jobs, and the daunting task of becoming adults, all while holding hands. He was a civil engineer, steady and reliable, the bedrock of my often chaotic world. I was a journalist, a job that fed my curiosity and occasionally sent me chasing stories across the state. We had a home, a little blue house with a garden I was ridiculously proud of, and a future we had mapped out on countless napkins in countless diners. And then there was Jessica, my sister, my younger sister. To say she was the golden child of our family would be an understatement. She was the sun, and I was a planet in her orbit. Growing up, Jessica could do no wrong. She was beautiful, effortlessly charming, the kind of person who could light up a room with a smile. I was the serious one, the studious one, the responsible older sister. If Jessica got a B, my parents would praise her for trying so hard. If I got an A-, they'd ask what went wrong. It wasn't malicious. It was just the way things were. Jessica was the fragile, brilliant artist who needed protecting, and I was the strong, capable one who could handle anything. This dynamic bled into our adult lives. When I married Mark, my parents were pleased but reserved. When Jessica dated a string of unsuitable men, they wrung their hands and worried endlessly. Mark was my rock, but he was also drawn into her orbit. He treated her like the little sister he never had, always there to help her move, fix her car, or offer a shoulder to cry on after her latest heartbreak. I never saw it as anything but kindness. I loved that my husband and my sister got along so well. The three of us were a unit, a tight-knit triangle of love and support, or so I thought. Our family gatherings were a performance of this dynamic. Jessica would hold court, telling dramatic stories about her life as a struggling painter, and my parents would hang on her every word. Mark would laugh at all her jokes. I would sit back and watch, a proud smile on my face, completely oblivious to the rot that was festering right under my nose. I was the frog in the slowly boiling water, content and unaware that the heat was being turned up, degree by painful degree. I remember one summer barbecue, just last year. Everything seemed so perfect it was almost painful to look at. Mark was at the grill, flipping burgers, laughing about something with my dad. Jessica was showing my mom her latest painting on her phone, her bright, tinkling laugh echoing across the backyard. I was sitting on the patio steps, a glass of iced tea in my hand, and I felt this wave of profound contentment wash over me. This was my life. These were my people. Everything was exactly as it should be. It's funny, the lies we tell ourselves to keep the peace, the little warning signs we choose to ignore. I see them all now, in hindsight, with a clarity that is both blinding and excruciating. I was so busy being the strong one, the capable one, that I never stopped to wonder if the foundations of my perfect life were rotting from the inside out. I just kept smiling, believing in the story I had written for myself, unaware that the two people I loved most in the world were co-authoring a secret, devastating chapter behind my back. The betrayal wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, creeping poison, so subtle at first that I convinced myself it was all in my head. It started with a shift in the atmosphere of our home. The easy, comfortable silence we once shared became heavy, fraught with unspoken things. Mark became distant, retreating into his work or his phone. He'd come home late, smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine, and dismiss my questions with a tired sigh. Just a long day at the site, he'd say, or had to work through lunch. He stopped touching me with the casual affection that had always been our language. A hand on my back as he passed, a kiss on the top of my head while I was reading it, all just stopped. The absence of it was a physical ache, a void that grew larger with each passing day. I remember trying to bridge the gap, suggesting date nights or weekend trips, things we used to love. but he was always too tired, too busy, too stressed. The man who once couldn't get enough of my time now seemed to be actively avoiding it. At the same time, Jessica started acting strangely. She was always the center of our family's drama, but this was different. She became evasive, cagey. She'd cancel our weekly sister dinners at the last minute, with flimsy excuses. When I did see her, she couldn't meet my eyes. She, who had always confided in me about every detail of her life, suddenly had nothing to say. Her conversations were all surface level, filled with an anxious energy that felt completely alien. I recall one afternoon I stopped by her apartment unannounced, just to say hello. She opened the door a crack, her face pale, and quickly stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind her. She said she was in the middle of a creative breakthrough and couldn't be disturbed. But I saw, just over her shoulder, a man's jacket slung over her armchair, a familiar jacket, a tan canvas jacket with a small tear on the sleeve that I had mended for Mark just a few months ago. When I mentioned it, she laughed it off, saying it was from a guy she was casually seeing. But her eyes darted away, and her hand trembled as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I tried to talk to Mark about it. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, I voiced my concerns. "Is everything okay with you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "You seem far away lately." He didn't even look up from his phone. "I'm fine, just tired. Work is a beast right now." "And what about Jessica?" I pressed gently. "She seems off too. Have you noticed?" He finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. "She seems fine to me. You're probably just imagining things, honey. You worry too much." It was the classic gaslighting line, designed to make me feel like the crazy one. And for a while, it worked. I told myself I was being paranoid. Mark was stressed. Jessica was being her usual dramatic self. I was the one creating a problem where none existed. I tried to push the feeling down, to ignore the gnawing unease in the pit of my stomach. I focused on my work, on our home, on the life I was so desperate to believe was still perfect. But the feeling was a splinter under the skin, a constant low-grade irritation that I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. It was a premonition, a dark whisper in the quiet moments, telling me that the ground beneath my feet was about to give way. The little inconsistencies kept piling up, each one a small crack in the facade of my marriage, until the whole structure was groaning under the weight of their lies. The universe has a funny way of trying to warn you. It sends you little signals, breadcrumbs of truth that, if you're paying attention, can lead you out of the dark woods of denial. My first real, undeniable breadcrumb came in the form of a credit card statement. Mark and I had always been transparent about our finances. We had a joint account for household expenses, but we kept our own credit cards for personal spending. His bill was usually predictable: gas, lunches, the occasional purchase from a hardware store. But this month, there was a charge that made me pause. A $90 charge from a store called The Gilded Lily. I'd never heard of it. I Googled the name. It was a high-end lingerie boutique on the other side of town, a place known for delicate, expensive things. My heart did a slow, painful somersault in my chest. Mark had never bought me lingerie in his life. It wasn't his style. He was a practical man, a man of flannel shirts and sensible shoes. This was so out of character, it felt like a glitch in the matrix. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was buying a gift for me? A surprise? But my birthday and our anniversary were months away. Maybe it was a mistake? A fraudulent charge? But the logical part of my brain, the journalist part that was trained to look for the story behind the story, knew better. People don't accidentally spend $90 on silk and lace. That night I confronted him, trying to sound casual, breezy, as if my entire world wasn't tilting on its axis. "Hey, I was going over the credit card bills and saw a charge for a place called The Gilded Lily. What's that?" I watched his face carefully, looking for the tell, the flicker of an eye, the tightening of a jaw. For a split second, a flash of pure panic crossed his eyes, before being replaced by a mask of practiced nonchalance. "Oh, that," he said, waving a dismissive hand as he scrolled through his phone. "I was getting a gift for my colleague, Sarah. Her bachelorette party is next week. A bunch of us from the office went in on it. The lie was smooth, plausible on the surface, but it was a lie. I knew it in my bones. Mark was not the kind of guy who organized group gifts for bachelorette parties. He barely remembered his colleagues' names, let alone their wedding dates. And he definitely wasn't the kind of guy who would be tasked with buying lingerie. The whole story felt thin, fragile, like a soap bubble about to pop. I didn't push it. I just nodded and said, "Oh, that's nice of you." But the seed of suspicion had taken root and was now sprouting with terrifying speed. I started paying closer attention. I became a detective in my own life, searching for clues that I desperately hoped I wouldn't find. And of course, once I started looking, they were everywhere. There was the second phone. I found it tucked away in the glove compartment of his truck when I was looking for an insurance card. A cheap, prepaid burner phone. A classic, almost cliché tool of the unfaithful. My hands shook as I turned it on. There was only one contact in it, saved under the initial J. My blood ran cold. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to grip the door to keep from falling. I put the phone back, wiping my fingerprints off the screen with the hem of my shirt. I didn't need to see the messages. I already knew. The J wasn't a stranger. It was my sister. My sweet, fragile, golden child sister. The lingerie wasn't for a colleague. It was for her. Every piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening finality. The distance, the lies, her evasiveness, his defensiveness. It wasn't in my head. It was real, and it was happening in my home, with my family right under my nose. I felt like a fool, a blind, trusting idiot who had been willfully ignoring the screaming red flags. The weight of their deception was crushing, suffocating. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the very air in my home was thick with their lies. The final, devastating piece of evidence came a few days later. It was the moment that transformed my suspicion into certainty, the moment that burned my old life to the ground. I came home from work early, a rare occurrence. An interview had been canceled at the last minute, and I found myself with a free afternoon. As I turned onto our quiet, tree-lined street, I saw her car. Jessica's bright red convertible, a ridiculous, impractical gift from our parents, was parked in our driveway. This wasn't entirely unusual. She often came over to use our Wi-Fi or borrow a book, always with some flimsy excuse that allowed her to be in our space. But today, seeing that car, after everything I had discovered, sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I parked my own car at the curb, a block away, and I walked toward my house, my heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I remember the sun was shining, birds were chirping, the world was carrying on with its cheerful, oblivious routine while mine was about to end. I used my key to open the front door, stepping inside as quietly as possible. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strangely loud in the silent house. No answer. I walked through the downstairs rooms. The living room was empty. A magazine left open on the coffee table. The kitchen was clean. A single glass of water on the counter. They weren't downstairs. A cold dread, thick and suffocating, began to creep up my spine. I knew where they were. I knew, but a part of my brain refused to accept it, refused to process the inevitable. I headed upstairs, my feet feeling like lead weights. Each step was a lifetime. Each creak of the floorboards was a gunshot in the silent house. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it. A sound from our bedroom. A quiet laugh. Her laugh. The sound was intimate, carefree, and it sliced through me like a shard of glass. It was the sound of my deepest betrayal, echoing from the most sacred space in my life. I stood there, frozen, outside the closed door of the room I shared with my husband. The room where we had built our life, our love, our future. The room where I slept every night, where I thought I was safe. And in that moment, I knew. The splinter of suspicion had become a gaping wound. The whisper of unease had become a deafening roar. And my beautiful, perfect world had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I didn't open the door. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A strange, terrifying calm washed over me. a clarity so sharp it hurt. To burst in on them would be to give them a scene, to give them the drama they probably craved. It would make me the hysterical wife, the shrew, the villain in their twisted romance. I refused to play that part. I would not give them the satisfaction of my tears or my rage. I turned around, my movements slow and deliberate, as if I were moving through water. I walked silently back down the stairs, each step an act of monumental self-control. I walked out the front door, closing it softly behind me, the click of the latch sounding like a final, definitive end. I got in my car, drove to the end of the street, and parked where I could still see the house. I just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind a blank, white canvas of shock. About 20 minutes later, she emerged. Jessica. She looked flushed, happy, her hair slightly messy. She got into her little red car and drove away, not even glancing in my direction. 5 minutes after that, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. "Hey honey, just leaving the site. Traffic is crazy. Might be a little late." The casual, easy lie sent from inside the house he had just desecrated was the final, brutal twist of the knife. He was still in there. He had been there the whole time. The lie wasn't just a betrayal. It was an insult. It was a testament to how stupid, how blind, how utterly clueless he thought I was. I didn't go back to that house, not that night. I couldn't. It was no longer my home. It was a crime scene. I called Mark, my voice eerily steady, a stranger's voice coming out of my mouth. "Hey, my editor just called me. There's a developing story a few hours away. A chemical spill. I have to go cover it. I'll be gone for a couple of days." It was the first lie of my new life, and it slipped out with terrifying ease, a perfect mirror of his own deception. "Oh," he said, and I could hear the undisguised relief in his voice. He didn't have to face me. He had been given a reprieve. "Okay, honey, be safe. Call me when you get there." He didn't ask what the story was. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't care. He was just glad I was gone, that he had been granted more time to live in his secret world. That phone call sealed his fate, and hers, in my mind. The absence of his concern was the final confirmation that the man I married was gone, replaced by this hollow, deceitful stranger. I spent the next 2 days in a cheap motel on the outskirts of a town I didn't know, living on stale coffee and the furious energy of my own grief. My mind was a chaotic whirlwind of pain, rage, and disbelief. My husband and my sister, my rock and my son. The two people I loved and trusted most in the world had conspired to betray me in the most intimate, cruel way imaginable. The images that flooded my mind were a special kind of torture. Them, together, in my house, in my bed. The thought was a physical violation, a desecration of everything I held sacred. How long had this been going on? How many lies had they told? How many times had they laughed behind my back, at my expense? I replayed the last few months in my head, and suddenly, everything made sense. The late nights at work, the secret phone calls, her evasiveness, his distance. It was all there, a trail of clues I had been too blind, too trusting to see. I thought about my parents, about how they had always coddled her, always made excuses for her. Would they do the same now? Would they tell me to forgive her, to keep the peace, to think of the family? The thought filled me with a cold dread that was almost as bad as the betrayal itself. The second day my phone rang. It was Jessica. My heart seized in my chest. I stared at her name on the screen, her smiling, innocent face looking back at me. My thumb hovered over the answer button. A part of me wanted to throw the phone against the wall, to never hear her voice again. But another part, the journalist part, the part that needed the full story, needed to hear the lie from her own lips. I answered. "Hey," I said, my voice a hollow echo of itself. "Hey, sis," she said, her tone bright, cheerful, sickeningly normal. "I was just calling to see how you are. Mark told me you had to rush off for work. Is everything okay?" The audacity of it, the sheer, unmitigated gall, stole my breath. She was calling me, pretending to be the concerned sister, after she had just been in my husband's arms, in my bed. The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over, cold and sharp. I kept my voice level, but each word was dipped in ice. "You know, Jess, I've been better." "Oh no, what's wrong?" she asked, the fake sympathy dripping from her words like poison. And that's when I dropped the bomb. I didn't plan it. The words just came out, cold and precise, a weapon I didn't know I had. "I know, Jessica." There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. A silence so profound I could hear my own blood roaring in my ears. Then, a nervous laugh. "No what? What are you talking about? You're being weird." "I know about you and Mark," I said. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of a cornered animal. I could almost hear the frantic spinning of the gears in her head as she tried to formulate a lie, a defense, an escape. I don't know what you're talking about," she finally stammered, her voice shaking, the cheerful facade crumbling. "You're being ridiculous." "Am I?" I said, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping my lips. "I saw your car, Jessica. I heard you in my house, in my bedroom." The line went dead. She had hung up. I stared at my phone, a grim satisfaction warring with the overwhelming pain. The first lie had been exposed. The first crack in their secret world had appeared. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the worst, the absolute worst, was yet to come. The family confrontation was going to be a bloodbath, and I was walking into it completely alone. The confrontation with my family was exactly the nightmare I had predicted, a masterclass in denial, blame-shifting, and emotional blackmail. After Jessica hung up on me, I knew the clock was ticking. She would go straight to Mark, and then they would go to our parents, trying to spin the story, to control the narrative before I could. They would paint me as hysterical, as paranoid, as the one who was destroying the family. I decided to beat them to it. I drove to my parents' house, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I found them in the living room, watching television, the picture of domestic tranquility. They were surprised to see me, thinking I was hours away on a work assignment. "What a lovely surprise," my mother chirped, her face lighting up with a smile that felt like a slap. "What brings you here, sweetie? I thought you were working." I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I stood in the middle of their perfectly tidy living room, the room where I had grown up, and I detonated my life. "Mark and Jessica are having an affair," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the emotion that was raging inside me. My mother's smile froze. My father muted the television. They stared at me, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What are you talking about?" my father finally said, his voice gruff, defensive. "That's a terrible thing to say about your sister." "It's the truth," I said, my voice unwavering. "I caught them. Yesterday. In my house. In my bed." I expected shock. I expected outrage on my behalf. I expected the love and support of my parents. What I got was something else entirely. Something so twisted and familiar it made my stomach turn. My mother's first reaction was not to comfort me, her betrayed daughter, but to defend Jessica, her golden child. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice rising in panic, her hands fluttering. "Jessica would never do that to you. She loves you, and Mark adores you. You must have misunderstood something." "I misunderstood my sister's car in my driveway and her laugh coming from my bedroom?" I shot back, my voice dripping with a sarcasm I didn't know I possessed. "How exactly does one misunderstand that, Mom?" Just then, as if on cue, the front door opened, and Mark and Jessica walked in. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with panic. They had clearly come to do damage control, not expecting to find me there. The room crackled with a tension so thick it was hard to breathe. My mother rushed to Jessica's side, wrapping an arm around her as if she were the one who needed protection. "What is this nonsense?" she demanded, looking at me, her eyes flashing with anger. "Your sister is hysterical. You've upset her terribly with these wild accusations." Jessica started to cry, fat, theatrical tears rolling down her cheeks. It was a performance I had seen 1,000 times before, a performance designed to elicit sympathy and deflect blame. "I don't know why she's saying these things," she sobbed, burying her face in my mother's shoulder. "It was a mistake. A one-time thing. It didn't mean anything. I love my sister." Mark, the coward, just stood there by the door, his face ashen, unable to look at me, unable to speak. His silence was his confession. It was my father who delivered the next blow. He looked at me, his face hard with disappointment in me, for disrupting their carefully constructed peace. "You need to calm down," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're making a scene. Whatever happened, we're a family. We'll deal with this privately." "Privately?" I echoed, my voice finally rising to a shriek I couldn't contain. "Your daughter slept with my husband. Your son-in-law. There is nothing private about that. He is my husband." And then Jessica, my precious, fragile sister, played her trump card. She lifted her tear-streaked face from our mother's shoulder, looked me straight in the eye, her expression a toxic cocktail of fear and triumph, and said the words that would incinerate what was left of my world. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. The room went silent. The air crackled, then seemed to be sucked out of the room entirely. I stared at her flat stomach, at the malicious, triumphant glint in her teary eyes. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a conquest. She hadn't just taken my husband, she had taken my future, the family I was supposed to have, the child I was supposed to raise with Mark. She had stolen it all. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father's face went slack with shock. But then, the most horrific thing happened. I watched as my mother's expression shifted from shock to something else, something I can only describe as a twisted kind of joy. A grandchild. The ultimate prize. The affair. The betrayal. My pain, it all melted away in the face of this new, blessed event. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, wet with tears for her new grandchild. "A baby," she breathed. "We have to think of the baby. You have to forgive them. For the baby's sake. For the family." I looked around the room, at my weeping, pregnant sister, at my spineless, cheating husband, at my father, who was already starting to calculate the logistics of this new reality, and at my mother, who was already planning a baby shower on the ashes of my marriage. And in that moment, I understood. I was utterly and completely alone. They were not my family. They were a tribe, and they had just voted me off the island. A cold, hard resolve settled over me. I would not cry. I would not scream. I would not give them the satisfaction. I looked at each of them, one by one, my gaze lingering on my sister. I let the silence stretch, letting them squirm in the wreckage they had created. Then I turned to my mother. "You want a grandchild?" I said, my voice eerily calm. "Fine. You can have one. You can have all of it. You can have her, you can have him, and you can have their baby. But you will not have me." I turned and walked out the door, leaving them standing there, stunned, in the ruins of the family I no longer claimed as my own. The drive away from my parents' house was a blur. I was operating on a level of pure, cold adrenaline. The grief and the rage had coalesced into a single, diamond-hard point of purpose. They had made their choice. They had chosen her, the affair, the baby. They had chosen the fantasy of a new family over the reality of the one they had just destroyed. Now, I would make my own choice. I would choose myself. I did not go back to my house. That place was a crime scene, a monument to my own foolishness, and it was tainted beyond repair. I drove to the nearest hotel, a sterile, anonymous place on the edge of the highway. I paid for a room in cash, and when I locked the door behind me, the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was the most comforting sound I had ever heard. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone, and the solitude was a strange, terrifying comfort. I sat on the edge of the cheap, stiff bed, and I began to plan my exit. This would not be a messy, emotional departure, filled with tearful phone calls and drawn-out goodbyes. It would be a surgical extraction. I would remove myself from their lives so cleanly and completely that it would be as if I had never been there at all. My mind, usually a tangle of story ideas and interview questions, became a machine of cold, hard logistics. First, money. The practicalities of survival asserted themselves with a brutal clarity. I logged into our joint bank account on the hotel's spotty Wi-Fi. I saw the balance. The money we had saved for a future that was now a fantasia down payment on a bigger house, a trip to Italy, a college fund for the children we were supposed to have. I transferred exactly half of it into my personal account. Not a penny more, not a penny less. I was not a thief. I was simply taking what was mine, what I had earned. I then went through our credit card accounts online. I paid off my personal card in full. I looked at the joint cards, the ones with the high limits that were tied to my excellent credit score, the ones Mark used for his business lunches and project materials. I called each company, navigating the automated menus with a grim patience, and reported my cards lost. I had them canceled and requested new ones, in my name only, be sent to a P.O. box I planned to open the next day. I left Mark with his own cards, his own debts, and his own salary, which I knew was not enough to sustain the lifestyle we had built together. Next, the house. The little blue house with the garden I loved, the house I had poured my heart and soul into. The thought of them living there, of Jessica raising their child in the rooms where Mark and I had dreamed of raising our own, was an unbearable, suffocating thought. I knew I couldn't fight them for it. That would require lawyers, confrontation, time. It would mean seeing them, talking to them, engaging with their poison. I didn't have the stomach for it, so I decided to let it go. It was just wood and nails, a physical object that was now contaminated. They could have it, but they would have to pay for it. I knew the mortgage was in both our names. I also knew that without my income, Mark would struggle to make the payments. That was a problem for his future, not my present. I started to research new cities, new places to live. I needed a clean break, a place where no one knew my name, where the ghosts of my past couldn't find me. I found a small apartment for rent in a city 1,000 miles away, a place known for its vibrant art scene and its blessed anonymity. I filled out the application online, using my newly secured funds to pay the deposit and first month's rent. I signed a digital lease. I had a new home. The final step was to cut the lines of communication. I went through my phone and systematically blocked their numbers. Mark, Jessica, my mother, my father, aunts, uncles, cousins who I knew would be weaponized by my parents to deliver guilt-tripping messages. I created a new, anonymous email address. I sent a single email to my editor, explaining that due to a severe family crisis, I was resigning, effective immediately. I told him I was sorry for the abrupt departure, but it was unavoidable. Then, I prepared one final message. I knew I couldn't just disappear without a trace. That would lead to missing person reports, to a search, to them finding me. I needed to let them know I was alive, and that my departure was a choice. I would leave a note, but not a letter of anguish or anger. Just a simple, cold statement of fact. My plan was set. All that was left was to execute it. I spent one more night in that sterile hotel room, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I slept. It was a deep, dreamless sleep, the sleep of a soldier who has accepted their mission and is ready for the battle ahead. The next morning, I drove to my house for the last time. The sun was bright, mocking the darkness that had enveloped my life. I parked down the street and waited, watching my heart, a cold, steady drum in my chest. I knew Mark would have gone to work. He was a creature of habit, and his guilt wouldn't be enough to disrupt his routine. Jessica was probably at my parents' house, being coddled, being celebrated, basking in her twisted victory. The house was empty. It was waiting for me. I let myself in with the key I still had on my ring, and the silence that greeted me was heavy, suffocating. The air was thick with their betrayal, a scent I could almost taste. The house looked the same, but it felt different. It felt like a stranger's house. I walked through the rooms, a ghost in my own life. I didn't look at the photos on the walls, the smiling, lying faces from a life that was now a fiction. I didn't touch the furniture we had picked out together on long, happy Saturdays. I went straight to my closet and my home office, the only two spaces that felt remotely mine. I had 4 empty suitcases in my car, purchased from a 24-hour department store the night before. I worked with a quiet mechanical efficiency, a robot programmed for a single task: erasure. I filled the suitcases with my clothes, my personal documents, my laptop, my journals, and a few small sentimental items that predated Mark: a box of old letters from college friends, a worn copy of my favorite book from childhood, a small, chipped seashell from a family vacation we took before Jessica was born. My entire life, packed into 4 suitcases. It was a surprisingly small pile, a testament to how much of my identity had been tied up in a man and a home that were no longer mine. As I was about to leave, I stood in the kitchen, the heart of our home, the place where we had shared thousands of meals and conversations. I took off my wedding ring and my engagement ring. The diamond, which had once seemed so full of light and promise, now looked like a cold, dead piece of glass. I placed them on the center of the kitchen table, right in the middle of a sunbeam that was streaming through the window. Next to them, I laid my house key. Then, I took a single sheet of paper from the printer. I thought for a moment about what to write. I could have filled pages with my rage, my pain, my heartbreak. I could have written them a letter that would have flayed them alive. But they didn't deserve my words. They didn't deserve my emotion. They deserved nothing. So, I wrote 4 words. 4 simple, devastating words. You can have it. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. They would know who it was from. And the ambiguity of the it, the house, the husband, the family, the life, would, I hoped, haunt them. Let them argue over its meaning. Let them project their own guilt onto those 4 simple words for the rest of their lives. I walked out the front door and didn't look back. I got in my car and drove, not to the highway, but to a local electronics store. I walked in and bought a cheap burner phone and a new SIM card. Then, I drove to a park, sat on a bench overlooking a duck pond, and took my old phone out of my purse. It was a sleek, expensive smartphone, filled with years of photos, messages, memories. It was the last link to my old life. I took a deep breath, and with a strength I didn't know I possessed, I snapped it in half. The screen spiderwebbed, then went dark. I threw the 2 pieces into a trash can. It was a symbolic execution, the final, definitive cut. As I drove out of the city, my new, clean phone on the passenger seat, I felt a wave of something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't joy. It was a quiet, fierce, and liberating sense of freedom. The old me, the trusting wife, the loving sister, the dutiful daughter had died, and from her ashes a new woman was being born. A woman who answered to no one but herself. My new life started with the drone of the highway and the promise of anonymity. The 1,000-mile drive was a kind of purgatory, a space between the hell I had left and the unknown future I was driving toward. With every mile marker that passed, I felt the layers of my old identity peeling away. I was no longer a wife, a sister, a daughter. I was just a woman in a car, a blank slate heading toward a new horizon. I drove for 2 days, stopping only for gas and cheap motel rooms where I paid in cash. I listened to angry music, to sad music, to no music at all. I let the silence of the road wash over me, a cleansing flood that carried away the debris of my former life. The city I chose was a world away from the manicured lawns and quiet streets of my old life. It was vibrant, chaotic, and gloriously indifferent. My apartment was small, on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building in a neighborhood filled with art galleries, tattoo parlors, and 24-hour diners. It came furnished with worn, mismatched furniture, but it was clean, and the large windows let in a flood of afternoon light and the sounds of the city sirens, street musicians, the murmur of a dozen different languages. It was the first space in my entire adult life that was entirely my own, and I cherished its anonymity. The first few weeks were a strange mixture of grief and liberation. There were moments when the weight of my loss would hit me with the force of a physical blow. I would be in the grocery store and see a brand of coffee Mark used to love, or I'd hear a song on the radio that Jessica and I used to sing along to in the car. and the pain would be so sharp, so sudden, it would take my breath away. In those moments, I would let myself cry. I would sit on the floor of my new, empty apartment, and I would mourn the life I had lost, the people I had loved who were now strangers to me. It was a necessary, painful exorcism. But there were other moments too. Moments of unexpected, intoxicating joy. The freedom of walking through a city where no one knew my story, where I was not the woman whose husband cheated with her sister. The simple pleasure of buying a coffee and sitting in a park, watching the world go by, beholden to no one. The quiet satisfaction of building a life from scratch, a life that was entirely of my own making. I found a job waiting tables at a busy little bistro a few blocks from my apartment. It was a world away from my old career as a journalist, but it was exactly what I needed. It was physical, demanding, and it kept my mind from spiraling into the dark corners of my past. It forced me to be present, to focus on the simple, tangible tasks of taking orders, carrying plates, and making small talk with strangers. I met people, my colleagues, a motley crew of artists, actors, and wanderers, all with their own stories, their own reasons for being here. They didn't ask about my past. In this city, you were allowed to be whoever you wanted to be. No questions asked. I kept in touch with one person from my old life, my cousin, Sarah. She was my mother's niece, but she had always been more of a friend to me, a quiet, observant woman who had seen the toxic family dynamic for what it was. Before I left, I sent her a letter with my new P.O. box address. I told her I was safe, and I asked her to be my one secret link to the world I had left behind. I knew I could trust her. I needed to know what happened, not because I wanted to go back, but because I needed to know that my departure had consequences. I needed to know that the bomb I had dropped had, in fact, gone off. A month into my new life, the first letter from Sarah arrived. My hands trembled as I opened it. The reckoning had begun. Sarah's first letter was a reluctant but detailed account of the immediate aftermath of my departure. My disappearance, she wrote, had sent a shockwave through the family. At first, there was panic. My parents, despite my note, had tried to file a missing persons report. They played the part of the worried, heartbroken parents whose fragile daughter had vanished. The police, however, were less sympathetic. An adult woman who leaves a note, empties half a joint bank account, and whose car is gone is not missing. She has left. My parents were told, in no uncertain terms, that there was nothing the police could do. This, Sarah wrote, was when the narrative began to shift. Since they couldn't paint me as a tragic victim, they began to paint me as a villain. I was unstable, cruel, vindictive. I had abandoned my husband and family in their time of need. I had overreacted to a simple mistake. The pregnancy, which had at first been the justification for their demand for my forgiveness, now became the centerpiece of their story. Jessica was the real victim here, a scared, pregnant young woman who had been cruelly cast aside by her hysterical older sister. My parents, of course, were the martyrs, left to pick up the pieces of the family I had shattered. They threw a baby shower for Jessica. Sarah described it as the most surreal, uncomfortable event she had ever attended. It was a lavish affair, held at my parents' house, filled with pastel decorations and forced smiles. My mother presided over the event like a queen, holding court, accepting congratulations on her impending grandchild, and telling anyone who would listen how they were all making the best of a difficult situation. Mark was there, looking like a ghost. He stood by Jessica's side, a strained, haunted look on his face, as she opened gifts for the baby, their baby. Sarah said the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Many of our old mutual friends didn't come. The ones who did kept their distance, offering polite, stilted congratulations before making a hasty exit. The story of the affair had begun to leak out, and people were taking sides. Most of them, it seemed, were taking mine. But the most significant consequence, the one that gave me a grim, cold sense of satisfaction, was financial. Mark, Sarah wrote, was in a full-blown panic. My departure had not just been an emotional blow, it was a financial catastrophe. My salary, had been the primary support for our comfortable lifestyle. Without it, the mortgage on our little blue house was an impossible burden. He had missed the first payment. The bank had started calling. The joint credit cards, which he had continued to use for a week after I left, had all been declined. He was facing a mountain of debt that was entirely of his own making, and he was realizing, with dawning horror, that he had to face it alone. He had, apparently, begged Jessica to help, but her meager income from selling the occasional painting was barely enough to cover her own expenses. Their grand romance was being tested by the harsh reality of late notices and collection calls. My parents were trying to help, funneling money to Mark to keep the house from going into foreclosure, but even their resources were not infinite. The beautiful, perfect life they had all conspired to steal was turning out to have a very high price tag. My quiet, surgical exit had been more effective than any screaming match or legal battle could have ever been. I hadn't destroyed their lives. I had simply stepped away and allowed them to be crushed under the weight of their own choices. The letter ended with a simple, chilling sentence. "Jessica is radiant," Sarah wrote. "She's never been happier. She says she finally has everything she ever wanted." Those words stayed with me for days. They were a reminder that for my sister, this was never just about love or passion. It was about winning. And for now, in her own twisted way, she thought she had won. The illusion of Jessica's victory, however, was short-lived. In her next letter, about 2 months later, Sarah detailed the rapid and spectacular disintegration of my sister's perfect world. The financial pressure, it turned out, was a relentless, corrosive force that was eating away at the foundations of her new life with Mark. The house, our house, became a source of constant, bitter arguments. Mark, once the steady, reliable man I had known, was becoming increasingly erratic and resentful. He was working overtime, taking on extra projects, but it was never enough. The bills kept piling up. He started blaming Jessica for the situation, for her expensive tastes, for her inability to contribute financially in any meaningful way. The man who had once been her co-conspirator in a thrilling, secret affair was now just her stressed-out, resentful roommate. The baby, the supposed blessing that was meant to sanctify their union, became another source of conflict. The costs associated with pregnancy doctor's appointments, prenatal vitamins, baby supplies were a constant drain on their already depleted resources. Jessica, who had always been coddled and cared for, was not equipped to handle the realities of impending motherhood, especially not under such stressful circumstances. She complained constantly about being tired, about being sick, about not having enough money to buy the designer baby clothes she saw online. The radiant, happy glow Sarah had described in her first letter had been replaced by a permanent scowl of discontent. Their social life had completely imploded. The few friends who had remained neutral at first had slowly drifted away, tired of the constant drama, tired of the toxic atmosphere that seemed to follow them everywhere. They were an island, isolated in a sea of their own making, and the isolation was breeding a special kind of contempt. Sarah recounted a story she had heard from a mutual acquaintance who had run into them at a grocery store. They were arguing in the cereal aisle, their voices low but sharp. Jessica was crying, accusing Mark of not loving her anymore. Mark, his face tight with anger, had hissed back, "What's to love? You've ruined my life." The fantasy had completely shattered. The charming, forbidden romance had devolved into a sordid, miserable affair of shared debt and mutual blame. They were trapped, not by love, but by the consequences of their actions, the baby, the house, the financial ruin. They were two people who had thought they were stealing a better life, only to find that they had created a prison for themselves. My parents were still trying to hold everything together, but the strain was showing. They had poured a significant amount of their own savings into trying to save the house, but it was a losing battle. My father, a man who had always been so proud and stoic, was starting to look old and tired. My mother, who had been so ecstatic about her impending grandchild, was now constantly stressed, caught in the middle of Mark and Jessica's endless fighting. They had gotten the grandchild they wanted, but it had come at a cost they had never anticipated. The most satisfying piece of news in Sarah's letter, however, was about the lingerie from the Gilded Lily. In a fit of anger, Mark had apparently thrown it in Jessica's face, screaming that the $90 he had spent on it could have gone toward the electricity bill. Jessica, in a rage, had cut it to shreds with a pair of scissors. It was a small, petty detail, but it felt significant. The symbol of their secret, illicit passion had been destroyed by the mundane, ugly reality of their new life. The gilded fantasy had been torn apart, leaving only the cheap, tattered remnants of their betrayal. The cracks in their sham of a life continued to widen, and Sarah's letters became a grim, serialized account of their downfall. The house, our little blue house, was the first major casualty. Despite my parents' financial help, Mark couldn't keep up with the mortgage. A foreclosure notice was posted on the front door, a public declaration of their failure. The shame, Sarah wrote, was immense. My parents were humiliated. Their friends and neighbors, who had all witnessed the slow, public implosion of our lives, now had a tangible symbol of the disaster. They were forced to sell the house in a short sale, losing not only the home but also any equity my parents had desperately poured into it. Mark and a very pregnant Jessica were forced to move into a cramped, two-bedroom apartment in a less desirable part of town. The move was apparently a nightmare of bitter accusations and sullen silences. The golden child, my sister, who had never lived in anything less than a picture-perfect home, was now living in a run-down apartment complex with peeling paint and a view of a parking lot. Her dream life had become a suburban nightmare. Mark's career began to suffer. He worked for a large, conservative engineering firm where appearances mattered. The whispers about his affair, the messy departure of his wife, and his subsequent financial problems had reached his superiors. He was passed over for a promotion he had been expecting. He was taken off a high-profile project. His bosses no longer saw him as a reliable, steady man. They saw him as a man with a chaotic, messy personal life, a liability. The resentment he felt toward Jessica grew with each professional setback. She was the source of all his problems, the anchor that was dragging him down. Their relationship, if you could even call it that, became a toxic stew of blame and regret. They were no longer pretending to be in love. They were just two people trapped in a cage of their own making, waiting for the arrival of a baby that now felt more like a sentence than a blessing. My family, the people who had demanded my forgiveness, were now living in a state of perpetual crisis management. My mother, who had dreamed of being the doting grandmother, now spent her days mediating fights between Mark and Jessica, or crying on the phone to her friends about how difficult her life had become. My father had retreated into a shell of angry silence, his disappointment in Jessica now warring with his lifelong habit of enabling her. The family they had fought so hard to protect was a dysfunctional, miserable mess. Sarah told me about a particularly telling incident. My mother had tried to throw a small family dinner to boost everyone's spirits. It ended with Jessica throwing a plate of food at Mark and storming out, screaming that he had ruined her life. My father had to physically restrain Mark from going after her. My mother was left sobbing at the head of the table, surrounded by the ruins of her perfect family dinner. The irony was so thick it was almost poetic. They had sacrificed my happiness, my marriage, my well-being for the sake of family. And now, that very family was a source of constant pain and misery. They had gotten what they wanted, and it was choking them. Through all of this, I remained a ghost. They had no way to contact me, no way to plead for my help, no way to drag me back into their vortex of drama. My silence was my shield, and it was also my most potent weapon. By removing myself from the equation, I had forced them to lie in the bed they had made, and it was becoming increasingly clear that it was a cold, hard, and lonely bed indeed. The baby was born in the dead of winter. A boy. Sarah sent me a short, simple note to let me know. She didn't include a photo, for which I was grateful. I didn't want to see his face. I didn't want to see the combination of their features, a living, breathing testament to their betrayal. The news hit me in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't anger or jealousy. It was a deep, profound wave of sadness. Not for them, but for the innocent child who had been born into this mess. He was the ultimate victim in all of this. a child of deceit, whose very existence was a constant reminder of a broken home and a shattered family. I grieved for the life he would have, a life overshadowed by the sins of his parents. I grieved for the fact that he was my nephew, my blood, and that I would likely never know him. The arrival of the baby did not, as my mother had hoped, magically heal the wounds and bring the family together. Instead, it seemed to amplify the dysfunction. The reality of a newborn, the sleepless nights, the constant crying, the overwhelming responsibility was a shock to the system for two people who were already at their breaking point. Jessica, who had envisioned motherhood as a series of beautifully filtered Instagram posts, was completely unprepared for the messy, exhausting reality. She struggled with postpartum depression, retreating further into herself, leaving the bulk of the childcare to Mark and my mother. Mark, already crushed by financial and professional stress, was now dealing with a screaming infant and a depressed, resentful partner. The cramped apartment felt smaller than ever. The life he had blown up his own for was now an inescapable nightmare of dirty diapers and curdled dreams. My parents were caught in the crossfire. They were now full-time grandparents, not by choice, but by necessity. My mother spent most of her days at Mark and Jessica's apartment, cleaning, cooking, and caring for the baby, her face a permanent mask of weary resignation. The joy of having a grandchild had been replaced by the grim duty of holding together a family that was determined to tear itself apart. They tried, of course, to maintain the facade. They sent out a birth announcement, a glossy card with a picture of a perfect, sleeping baby, with the proud parents' names printed beneath. Sarah sent me a copy. It was a masterpiece of denial, a carefully constructed piece of propaganda designed to project an image of a happy, normal family. But Sarah knew the truth. She told me that behind the scenes, things were worse than ever. Mark had started drinking heavily. Jessica barely left her bed. They fought constantly, vicious, ugly fights that the neighbors could hear through the thin apartment walls. The baby was a pawn in their war, a weapon they used against each other. "He has your eyes," Jessica would spit at Mark during a fight. A constant reminder of my mistake. This was the family they had chosen. This was the life they had created. And it was a special kind of hell. A few months after the baby was born, I received a letter. Not from Sarah, but from my mother. It had been forwarded from my old P.O. box, a service I had forgotten to cancel. Her handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. The letter was a rambling, desperate plea. She wrote about the baby, how beautiful he was, how much he needed his aunt. She wrote about how hard things were, how much they were all struggling. She wrote that Jessica was sorry, that Mark was sorry, that they had all made a terrible mistake. And then came the line that I knew was coming, the line that they had been leading up to all along. "We need your help," she wrote. "Mark is going to lose his job if things continue like this. We can't afford the apartment. We need you to come home. We need you to forgive them, for the sake of the baby, for the sake of the family." The letter was not an apology. It was a summons, a demand. They hadn't learned a thing. They still saw me not as a person who had been grievously wronged, but as a resource, a solution to their self-inflicted problems. They wanted me to come back and fix the mess they had made. I read the letter once. Then I walked to the small fireplace in my apartment, and I burned it. I watched as my mother's desperate, selfish words turned to ash, and I felt nothing but a cold, hard resolve. They had made their bed. Now, they would have to lie in it, alone. For a year, I heard nothing. The silence from my old P.O. box was a quiet confirmation that my mother's letter had been their last, desperate gambit. I had not responded, and they had, it seemed, finally accepted that I was gone. In that year, my new life began to truly blossom. The job at the bistro, which had started as a temporary stopgap, became something more. The owner, a fiery French woman named Colette, saw something in Memi work ethic, my organizational skills, my quiet competence. She promoted me to manager. I was no longer just waiting tables. I was running the restaurant, hiring staff, managing budgets, creating schedules. I had found a new career, one that I was surprisingly good at, one that had been born not from a plan, but from a necessity. I moved out of my small, furnished apartment and into a larger one, a place with a small balcony where I could grow my own garden. I filled it with my own furniture, my own art, my own life. It was the first home that was truly mine, and I savored every inch of it. The wounds of the past were still there, but they had faded from gaping, angry gashes to thin, silvery scars. They were a part of my story, a part of my history, but they no longer defined me. I was not the woman who was betrayed. I was the woman who survived. I even started dating again. His name was Leo. He was a musician I had met at an open mic night. He was kind, funny, and he had the gentlest eyes I had ever seen. He knew a vague version of my story, that I had left a bad marriage and a toxic family behind to start over. He never pressed for details. He respected my past and was more interested in our future. It was slow, it was cautious, but it was real. And it was built on a foundation of honesty and trust. I had almost managed to convince myself that my old life was well and truly buried. Then, the email arrived. It was from an address I didn't recognize, a generic string of letters and numbers. The subject line was just my name, Anna. My heart stopped. No one in my new life called me by my full name. It was a name that belonged to my past. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. My hand trembled as I moved the cursor to open it. I knew who it was from before I even saw the words. It was her. It was Jessica. The email was long, a rambling stream of consciousness mess, a digital torrent of self-pity and manipulative apologies. She wrote about how sorry she was, how she thought about me every day, how she knew she had made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. She told me that she and Mark had finally, officially, split up. He had moved out months ago, and she was living alone with her son, my nephew, struggling to make ends meet. She painted a picture of a lonely, miserable life, a life of regret and solitude. She said she had been in therapy, that she had done the work, and that she finally understood the depth of the pain she had caused. She wrote about our childhood, about how she had always looked up to me, how she had always been jealous of my strength and my intelligence. It was a masterful performance of penitence, designed to pull at my heartstrings, to make me feel sorry for her, to re-establish the old dynamic of the fragile little sister and the strong, forgiving older one. The email ended with a desperate, hopeful plea. "I know I have no right to ask this," she wrote, "but my son, your nephew, is growing up without any family. He asks about you." I showed him a picture. "He deserves to know his aunt, and I miss my sister more than anything. Could we just talk? On the phone? I don't expect forgiveness. I just want a chance to tell you how sorry I am." I read the email twice, my face impassive. A year ago, these words might have destroyed me. They might have sent me spiraling back into the darkness. But now, I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no sadness. Just a profound, unshakable indifference. She was a stranger, confessing her sins to a woman who no longer existed. Her words were a ghost's whisper, and I was no longer listening. She hadn't changed. She was still trying to get what she wanted, using her son, my nephew, as a pawn in her game. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry for how it had turned out for her. I let Jessica's email sit in my inbox for a full week. I didn't want to respond out of emotion, out of a lingering flicker of the rage I once felt. I wanted my final word to be delivered from a place of absolute peace and unshakable resolve. I owed that to the woman I had become. During that week, I thought about her, about Mark, about my parents. I thought about the wreckage they had created, not with anger, but with a strange, clinical detachment. I learned, through a final, brief letter from Sarah, what had become of them all. Jessica's email had been mostly true. She and Mark were done. Their relationship, built on the thrill of deception, could not withstand the dreary, grinding reality of their consequences. Mark had lost his job, his house, his self-respect. He was, according to Sarah, a ghost of his former self, working a lower-paying job in another city, trying to outrun the shame that clung to him like a shadow. He paid a pittance in child support and saw his son on alternating weekends, a duty he performed with a heavy, resentful sigh. He was a broken man, haunted by the life he had so carelessly thrown away. Jessica was, as she had said, alone. My parents were helping her financially, but their relationship was strained. Their golden child had tarnished, and the constant need to support her, both financially and emotionally, had exhausted them. They were living in a quiet, joyless house, their retirement years spent managing the fallout of their daughter's life choices. They had gotten the family they chose, and it was a family of obligation and regret. My nephew, the innocent at the center of this storm, was being raised in a home filled with the ghosts of a dead affair, his mother's bitterness, and his grandparents' weary disappointment. It was a sad, lonely legacy, and it was entirely of their own making. After a week of contemplation, I sat down at my computer. I knew what I had to say. My response was not long. It was not emotional. It was a simple, direct, and final rejection. Jessica, I began, using her full name to create a sense of formal distance. I have received your email. I am writing this response not to open a dialogue, but to close one permanently. I addressed her points one by one, not to argue, but to dismantle her carefully constructed narrative of victimhood. You say you are sorry, I wrote, but your sorrow seems to be for yourself. You are sorry your life is hard. You are sorry you are alone. You are not sorry for the pain you caused, only for the consequences you are now facing. True remorse is a quiet, internal reckoning, not a desperate plea for absolution. I continued, my fingers moving steadily across the keyboard, each word a final, definitive brick in the wall I had built between my new life and my old one. You say your son deserves to know his aunt. You are right. He does deserve a family. But he also deserves a family that is not built on a foundation of lies and betrayal. You chose to bring him into this world under these circumstances. His family is now your responsibility to build, and it will not include me. Do not use your son as a tool to ease your own conscience. He has been through enough. The final paragraph was the most important. It was where I would draw the final, indelible line. You say you miss your sister. That sister, the one you knew, the one who loved you and trusted you, is gone. You killed her. You and Mark and Mom and Dad, you all stood by and watched her burn. I am someone else now, a woman you do not know, and this woman feels nothing for you. Not hate, not anger, just a vast, empty indifference. That is the truest closure you will ever get from me. My life is good now. It is peaceful, and it is mine. I will not allow you to disturb it ever again. This is the last time you will ever hear from me. Goodbye. I read it over once. It was cold. It was brutal. And it was the absolute, unvarnished truth. I hit send without hesitation. A sense of profound finality washed over me. It was not a victory. It was not revenge. It was an act of self-preservation. It was the final shovelful of dirt on the grave of a life and a family that was no longer mine. And so, this is where my story ends. Or rather, this is where my new story begins. The past 2 years have been a journey through a private hell, but I have emerged on the other side, not unscathed, but remade. I have learned that a person's character is not defined by the betrayals they suffer, but by how they respond to them. I chose not to be a victim. I chose not to be consumed by hate. I chose to rebuild, on my own terms, in my own way. My life in this vibrant, noisy city is simple, but it is real. I have my job at the bistro, a place that feels more like a family than my actual family ever did. I have my friends, who value me for who I am, not for the role I play. I have my little apartment with its balcony garden, a small patch of green in a concrete world, a place that is entirely mine. And I have Leo. Our relationship is a quiet, steady flame, a world away from the consuming, destructive fire of my past. It is built on the simple, radical foundation of honesty. We talk, we laugh, we trust. It is a revelation. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I look forward to it. I have learned that it is possible to survive the unthinkable. It is possible to walk through the fire and not be burned. It is possible to lose everything you thought you wanted and find something even better, something truer, in the wreckage. To anyone reading this who might be going through their own version of hell, who has been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you most, know this: you are stronger than you think. Do not let their betrayal define you. Do not let their lies become your truth. Your greatest power is your ability to walk away, to choose silence over drama, to choose peace over war. Rebuild your life on your own terms. And one day, I promise, you will wake up and realize that the ghosts of the past no longer have any power over you. You will be free. Thank you for listening to my story. If you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more real-life stories from people who have walked through the fire and come out the other side, stronger and ready to live again.